The howling wind cut through the Arctic tundra like 1,000 frozen knives, and Dr. Jake Morrison figured this was probably the dumbest thing he'd ever signed up for in his entire career. The thermometer clipped to his parka read -58 degrees Celsius, and that wasn't even accounting for the wind chill that made his exposed cheeks feel like they were being sandpapered off his face. He squinted through his goggles at the massive ice formation rising out of the permafrost about 200 yards ahead, the thing that had brought their whole team out to this godforsaken corner of northern Siberia in the first place. The satellite imagery hadn't done it justice. The structure, if you could call it that, looked like some kind of ancient fortress made entirely of ice, its walls rising at least 60 feet into the gray sky, covered in strange geometric patterns that definitely weren't natural. "You seeing this, Jake?" Marcus Reed's voice crackled through the radio, barely audible over the screaming wind. Marcus was their expedition leader, a grizzled former Army Ranger who'd done more crazy stuff before breakfast than most people did in a lifetime. He was up ahead with Rebecca Haynes, their archaeologist, both of them looking like orange marshmallows in their extreme cold weather gear. "Becky says those markings are consistent with late Neolithic period, maybe earlier. We're talking 10, maybe 12,000 years old, man." Jake keyed his radio, his fingers already going numb despite the thermal gloves. "That's impossible. Nothing man-made survives that long in these conditions. The ice shifts, breaks apart, reforms. Even if someone built something here, it would have been crushed to powder by now." He trudged forward, each step a battle against the wind that seemed determined to shove him back toward their base camp 5 miles behind them. The rest of the team was spread out in a loose formation, Tommy Kowalski and Brad Jenkins hauling the ground-penetrating radar equipment on a sled, Linda Patterson documenting everything with a cold-resistant camera that cost more than Jake's first car, and bringing up the rear was their security guy, a quiet dude named Hank Miller who supposedly had some kind of spooky special forces background nobody talked about. When Jake finally reached the ice wall, he had to crane his neck back to take in the full scope of it. Up close, those geometric patterns became even more bizarre. They weren't random scratches or natural formations. These were deliberate, precise, almost like circuit boards or some kind of ancient computer language. Rebecca was already running her gloved hand along them, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement that archaeologists got when they stumbled onto something that would rewrite the textbooks. "This is insane," she breathed, and even through the radio, Jake could hear the awe in her voice. The precision, the complexity, whoever made this had advanced knowledge of mathematics, geometry, probably astronomy too. "Look at these angles, they're perfect. You don't get that by accident." Marcus was all business, like always. "Yeah, it's real cool and all, but we're burning daylight, and we've only got maybe 4 hours before we need to head back. Tommy, Brad, get that radar set up. I want to know what's inside this thing before we go poking any holes in it." He turned to Hank, who was scanning the horizon with a pair of high-powered binoculars, his rifle slung across his chest. "Anything?" "Negative," Hank replied, his voice flat and professional. "No movement, no heat signatures except us. Whatever this place is, we're alone out here." There was something in the way he said it, though, that made Jake's skin crawl under all his layers. Like maybe being alone wasn't actually the comfort it should have been. Tommy and Brad got to work, setting up the portable radar array on its tripod, connecting cables to the laptop that Linda had to keep inside her parka to prevent it from freezing solid. The whole process took about 20 minutes, during which Jake did his own examination of the ice wall. He was a glaciologist, not an archaeologist, and from his perspective, this ice was all wrong. It was too clear, too pure, like it had been formed all at once in absolutely perfect conditions. Natural ice accumulated in layers over thousands of years, trapping air bubbles, sediment, all kinds of impurities. This stuff looked like it had been manufactured in a lab, which was obviously ridiculous because they were standing in the middle of nowhere, in a place where humans probably hadn't even existed when this thing was built. "Got something," Brad announced, staring at the laptop screen. "Oh man, you guys need to see this." The team clustered around, their breath creating little clouds of vapor that instantly froze into tiny ice crystals. The radar image on the screen showed the ice wall in cross-section, revealing that it wasn't just a wall at all. It was hollow. Inside the ice formation was a massive chamber, maybe 100 feet across, and the radar was picking up shapes inside. Lots of shapes. Arranged in rows. "Are those?" Linda started, adjusting her camera to photograph the screen. "Bodies," Rebecca finished, her voice going quiet. "It's a tomb. Or a burial chamber. Holy crap, this is the find of the century. There could be dozens of preserved Neolithic humans in there, perfectly frozen, their DNA intact. Do you understand what this means?" Jake understood what it meant, all right. It meant their simple glacial survey expedition had just turned into something way bigger and way more complicated. It meant weeks, maybe months of bureaucratic nightmares, permits, jurisdictional fights between Russia, the UN, and probably half a dozen universities. It meant their nice, quiet research grant was about to become an international incident. But looking at Rebecca's face, the pure joy of discovery written all over it, he didn't have the heart to rain on her parade just yet. Marcus made the call. "Okay, we document everything, take samples of the ice, get as much data as we can today. Tomorrow we bring the thermal drilling equipment and see if we can open it up without destroying anything." He glanced at his watch, a chunky mechanical thing that could survive anything. "We've got 2 hours before we need to start heading back. Let's make them count." They worked with practiced efficiency, each team member knowing their role. Linda photographed every inch of the exterior wall from multiple angles. Rebecca made detailed sketches of the geometric patterns and took measurements. Tommy and Brad ran the radar over every section, building a complete three-dimensional map of the internal structure. Jake took ice cores, drilling small samples that he carefully stored in refrigerated containers. The whole time, Hank maintained a perimeter, watching, always watching, like he expected something to come boiling out of the frozen ground. It was Jake who noticed the sound first. He was drilling his 5th core sample when he felt it more than heard it, a vibration coming through the ice, transmitted up through the drill bit and into his hands. He stopped, pulled the drill back, pressed his ear against the wall. There it was again. A deep, subsonic rumble, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. "Hey, anyone else feeling that?" he called out. Marcus was beside him in seconds. "Feeling what?" "Put your hand on the ice," Jake instructed. They both pressed their palms flat against the surface. For a moment, nothing. Then it came again, that low-frequency pulse, felt rather than heard. Marcus's eyes met Jake's, and for the first time since they'd arrived, Jake saw something he'd never seen in the tough ex-ranger's face: uncertainty. "Probably just the structure settling," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Temperature differentials, expansion and contraction, that kind of thing." "Right, Jake?" Jake wanted to agree, to write it off as some normal geological process, but he couldn't. "Ice doesn't pulse like that," he said quietly. "Ice cracks, shifts, breaks. It doesn't beat." "Okay, that's officially creepy," Tommy announced, packing up the radar equipment a little faster than necessary. "Maybe we should, come back tomorrow with more people. And bigger guns. I'm just throwing that out there." Brad laughed, but it sounded forced. "What, you think frozen cavemen are gonna wake up and chase us?" "Dude, they've been dead for 10,000 years." The rumbling came again, stronger this time, and a thin crack appeared in the ice near where Jake had been drilling. Everyone took an involuntary step back. The crack spread, branching out in a lightning bolt pattern, and from somewhere deep inside the structure came a sound that made Jake's blood run cold. It was like wind howling through a tunnel, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded almost like voices. Lots of voices. moaning. "Pack it up, now," Marcus ordered, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "Everyone back to the sleds. Move it." Nobody argued. They grabbed their equipment, threw it onto the sleds without worrying about being careful, and started hoofing it back the way they'd come. The wind had picked up even more, driving snow into their faces, cutting visibility down to maybe 30 feet. Jake kept looking back over his shoulder at the ice fortress, which was already fading into the whiteout conditions. The crack they'd caused was definitely spreading. He could see it even through the snow, a dark line splitting the pristine ice like a wound. They'd made it maybe a quarter mile when Hank suddenly threw up a fist, the military's signal for stop. Everyone froze. "Contact," Hank said into the radio, bringing his rifle up. 3 o'clock, 200 yards. Multiple figures, moving this direction. Jake strained to see through the snow. At first, there was nothing, just the endless white expanse. Then he saw them. Dark shapes, human-sized, shambling through the storm. His first thought was that they were another research team, maybe Russian scientists who had a claim to this area. But as the figures got closer, details started to emerge that made his stomach drop into his boots. Their movement was wrong, jerky and uncoordinated, like puppets on tangled strings. And their skin, what he could see of it, was dark. Not dark like a tan or natural skin color. Dark like frostbite, like tissue that had been frozen and thawed too many times. "What the hell are those?" Linda whispered, her camera forgotten in her hands. Rebecca had her binoculars up. "Oh God. Oh God, they're not wearing any clothes. They should be dead. The temperature, the exposure, they should be frozen solid, but they're moving. They're coming toward us." Marcus started barking orders. "Hank, fire a warning shot over their heads. Everyone else, get behind the sleds, now." Hank's rifle cracked, the sound weirdly flat in the snow-dampened air. The figures didn't react. Didn't stop, didn't speed up, didn't dive for cover. Just kept coming with that awful lurching gait. Now Jake could see their faces, and he immediately wished he couldn't. Their eyes were milky white, their lips pulled back from their teeth in frozen grimaces, their skin covered in a layer of frost that cracked and reformed with each movement. "They're not alive," Jake heard himself say. "They can't be alive. Look at them. They're frozen. Then why are they moving?" Brad's voice had gone up about an octave. "Somebody please tell me why they're moving." Hank fired again, and this time it wasn't a warning shot. The rifle round took the lead figure in the chest, a kill shot that should have dropped a man instantly. The figure stumbled, looked down at the hole in its torso like it was a mild inconvenience, and kept coming. No blood. No cry of pain. Nothing but that relentless forward motion. "They're not going down," Hank reported, his professional comm starting to crack around the edges. Multiple center mass hits, no effect. Requesting orders. Marcus didn't hesitate. "We run. Forget the equipment, just run. Back to base camp, now." They ran. God help them, they ran like hell, abandoning the sleds with all their expensive gear, abandoning protocol and procedure and everything they'd been trained to do. The survival instinct kicked in hard, that ancient part of the human brain that knew when you were prey. Jake's lungs burned with the cold air, each breath feeling like inhaling broken glass. His legs pumped, fighting against the snow and the wind and the knowledge that something impossible was chasing them. Behind them, he could hear the things. Not footsteps, exactly, but a shuffling, scraping sound, like frozen meat being dragged across ice. And that moaning. That awful, hollow moaning that didn't sound like it came from living throats. Tommy went down, tripped over something buried in the snow, and Brad hauled him up without breaking stride, both of them gasping and terrified. Linda was crying, tears freezing on her cheeks, her camera gone, lost somewhere in the snow. Rebecca kept looking back, Her scientific mind probably still trying to process what she was seeing, trying to fit it into some rational framework. They'd covered maybe 2 miles when Jake risked a glance back. The creatures were still there, still following, and there were more of them now. Way more. They were pouring out of the ice fortress like ants from a disturbed nest, a shambling horde of frozen corpses that had no business being able to move. The crack in the ice wall had become a full breach, and they were emerging from the darkness inside, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They're spreading out, Hank observed, still running but somehow managing to maintain tactical awareness. Trying to flank us. They're hunting us. How is that possible? Rebecca panted. They can't think. They're dead. They've been dead for thousands of years. Well, they're doing a pretty good job for dead things, Marcus shot back. Hank, can we make it to base camp before they cut us off? Hank did some kind of mental calculation, factoring in their speed versus the creature's speed versus the distance remaining. It's going to be close. Real close. And that's assuming there aren't more of these things between us and base. As if the universe wanted to prove his point, shapes appeared ahead of them, emerging from the snow like ghosts. More of the frozen dead, their ancient faces locked in expressions of hunger and rage. They were trapped, caught between 2 groups of impossible things that wanted them dead. Or worse. Marcus made a split-second decision. We go through them. Stay tight, stay together. Hank and I will clear a path. Everyone else, right behind us, don't stop for anything. He drew his pistol to complement Hank's rifle. On 3. 1. 2. 3. They charged, and it was the most terrifying thing Jake had ever done. The creatures ahead of them reacted, moving to intercept, their frozen arms reaching out with surprising speed. Hank's rifle barked in rapid semi-automatic fire, aiming for heads now since center mass shots didn't work. The results were better. A frozen skull exploded into fragments of ice and ancient bone, and the body attached to it collapsed like a marionette with cut strings. Marcus was firing his 9mm at point-blank range, each shot carefully placed, taking down the creatures one by one. Jake found himself swinging the ice drill like a club, smashing it into a frozen face that got too close. The impact sent a shock up his arms, but the creature went down, its jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. Tommy and Brad were using one of the equipment cases as a battering ram, bowling over anything in their path. Rebecca had grabbed a ice axe from somewhere and was wielding it with surprising ferocity, burying it in frozen skulls with the dedication of someone who definitely had enough of this nonsense. They broke through the line, leaving shattered bodies in their wake, and resumed their desperate sprint toward base camp. Jake's heart was hammering so hard he thought it might explode. His vision was narrowing, his body reaching the limits of what it could do in these extreme conditions. The cold was sapping their strength, every movement requiring twice the normal effort. How much further? How much longer could they keep this up? Then, like a miracle, he saw it, the lights of base camp, glowing through the storm. The cluster of prefab buildings and Quonset huts that had never looked so beautiful. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. There. Linda gasped, pointing with a shaking hand. We're almost there. But Hank was looking back at the pursuing horde, and his expression was grim. They're not stopping. They're going to follow us right to the camp. We'll be trapped there. The camp has reinforced doors, walls, heat, Marcus argued. We can fortify it, call for extraction. It's our best shot. They staggered into the base camp, and Marcus immediately started shouting orders. Get inside, Building 3, it's got the reinforced door and the smallest number of windows. Move! The team piled into the designated building, which served as their main lab and living quarters. Marcus and Hank were the last ones in, slamming the heavy steel door behind them and throwing the deadbolt. For a moment, there was just the sound of heavy breathing, of people trying to process what had just happened. Tommy broke the silence. What the hell were those things? Somebody please tell me what we just saw because my brain is not computing right now. He was shaking, whether from cold or fear or both, Jake couldn't tell. Rebecca had collapsed into one of the lab chairs, her face pale. Preserved corpses. Has to be. The permafrost, the extreme cold, it can preserve tissue for millennia. The bacteria, the viruses, they don't die, they just go dormant. And when the ice melts... She trailed off, her eyes going wide. When the ice melts, they wake up. You're talking about a disease? Linda asked. Some kind of ancient plague that reanimates dead tissue? It would explain the movement, the lack of normal physiological responses to trauma, Rebecca said, slipping into lecture mode like it was a security blanket. There are fungi that take over insect brains, make them into zombies essentially. Parasites that control host behavior. What if there was something like that, frozen in the ice with those bodies, and when we drilled into the structure, when we created that crack, we let warm air in, started a thaw, and woke it up? Jake thought about the vibration he'd felt, that rhythmic pulse. Not a heartbeat. Their metabolism, he said quietly. We felt their metabolism starting up. Like frozen frogs or wood frogs, they let themselves freeze solid in winter, then thaw out in spring and hop away like nothing happened. But these things, they've been frozen for 10,000 years. A sound interrupted them. A scratching, scraping sound coming from outside. Everyone went silent. The sound came again, nails on metal, and then a slow, deliberate pounding on the door. They were here. Marcus moved to one of the small windows, peered out carefully through the frost-covered glass, then swore quietly but emphatically. We've got maybe 30 of them out there. And more coming. A lot more. He pulled out his satellite phone, started dialing. I'm calling for extraction. We need to get off this ice, like, yesterday. The satellite connection took forever to establish in the storm conditions. While Marcus argued with whoever was on the other end, trying to convey the urgency without sounding completely insane, the rest of the team started fortifying their position. Brad and Tommy pushed heavy equipment cabinets against the door. Hank did an inventory of their weapons, one rifle with about 80 rounds, 2 pistols with 4 magazines between them, and various tools and equipment that could potentially be used as weapons. Not great odds if they had to fight their way out. Extraction team can be here in 6 hours, Marcus announced, ending the call. They're launching from Tixie now, but the storm's slowing them down. We need to hold out until dawn. 6 hours. Jake checked his watch. It was just past 3 in the afternoon local time, which meant sunset was coming in about an hour, and then they'd have a long polar night to survive. 6 hours of darkness, trapped in a building, surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. We can do 6 hours, he said, trying to sound confident. We've got heat, light, walls. We've got this. The power went out 30 seconds later, plunging them into darkness. Okay, we don't got this, Tommy squeaked. Emergency lights kicked in after a moment, bathing everything in a dim red glow. Marcus was already moving toward the electrical panel. Something cut the main power line from the generator. These things are smarter than they look. He flipped switches, trying to reroute power, but nothing worked. We're on battery backup. We've got maybe 4 hours of emergency power, then we're in the dark for real. They cut the power, Brad repeated. They cut the power. That means they're thinking, planning. Oh man, I want to go home. I want to go home right now. Hank was at the window again, his rifle ready. Movement. Multiple contacts, all sides. They're surrounding the building. The scratching sounds were everywhere now, on the walls. On the door, even on the roof. The creatures were testing the structure, looking for a way in. Jake tried to remember the building specs. Steel-reinforced polymer walls, designed to withstand extreme weather and polar bear attacks. The windows were triple-pane Lexan, nearly impossible to break. They should be safe in here. Should be. A crash from the back of the building made everyone jump. Hank moved toward the sound, weapon raised. Stay here, he ordered, disappearing into the darkened corridor that led to the storage rooms. They heard him moving, careful and controlled, then a burst of rifle fire, bright muzzle flashes illuminating the hallway. Then Hank came sprinting back. "They're in the vents. They're coming through the air vents." And then all hell broke loose. A frozen arm smashed through a ceiling vent, reaching down with grasping fingers. Then another. The creatures started dropping from above, their frozen bodies hitting the floor with meaty thunks before scrambling upright and lurching toward the team. Hank fired in controlled bursts, dropping 3 of them, but more were coming. Marcus joined in with his pistol, the confined space making every shot deafeningly loud. Jake grabbed the first heavy object he could find, a metal rod from a core sampling kit, and swung for the fences at a creature that used to be a woman. Her ancient furs rotted away, her frozen flesh covered in intricate tattoos that marked her as someone important in whatever culture she'd come from. The rod caved in her skull, and she went down hard. Rebecca was screaming, backing into a corner as one of the creatures advanced on her, its frozen hands outstretched. Linda hit it from the side with a chair, knocking it off balance, and Tommy followed up with a fire extinguisher to the head, pulverizing it. "We can't stay here." Marcus yelled over the chaos. "We need to move, now." Building 2, the sleeping quarters, it's got a smaller vent system, they can't get in as easily. "We'll never make it," Brad protested. "There's too many of them outside." "We stay here, we die," Hank stated flatly, dropping an empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one. "We move, we might die." "I'll take might over definitely any day." Marcus kicked open the connecting door between buildings, the one that let them move between structures without going outside. The corridor was dark and narrow, and Jake's imagination populated it with 1,000 horrors. But there was nothing there. They rushed through, Marcus in the lead, Hank bringing up the rear, constantly turning to check behind them. More creatures were pouring through the vents in the building they'd just abandoned. The things moved slowly individually, but in a group, their sheer numbers made them terrifying. Building 2 was smaller, more defensible. One room with 8 bunks, a small bathroom, and crucially, heating vents that were too narrow for even a child to fit through, let alone a full-grown frozen corpse. They piled inside, and Hank used a welding tool from the emergency kit to seal the connecting door shut. For the moment, they were safe. For the moment. "Everybody okay?" Marcus did a head count. All 6 of them, bruised, terrified, exhausted, but alive. "Sound off, anyone hurt?" Nobody was injured, at least not seriously. Tommy had a bruised shoulder from hitting a wall. Linda had scraped her hand on something. Minor miracles. Jake slumped against one of the bunks, trying to catch his breath, trying to process everything. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. And yet it was happening. Ancient corpses, reanimated by some unknown pathogen or parasite, hunting them across the frozen wasteland. It was like something out of a bad movie, except the terror was real, the cold was real, the very real possibility of dying was extremely real. Rebecca had her tablet out, frantically typing notes with shaking fingers. "We need to document this. The scientific implications, the archaeological significance, we can't lose this data." Marcus stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "Becky, we're about 2 seconds from being torn apart by frozen zombies, and you're worried about taking notes? If we don't document it, who's going to believe us?" she shot back. "They'll think we made it up, went crazy from the isolation. We need evidence." She had a point, Jake realized. Without proof, they'd be laughed out of the scientific community. Or worse, locked up for observation. Linda still had her backup camera, a small unit she kept in her parka. She started filming, narrating in a shaky voice, documenting the sounds of the creatures outside, the sealed door, the terrified faces of the team. Hank was at the single small window, watching the horde outside. "They're not leaving. They're just standing out there, waiting." Jake joined him, looked out at the mass of frozen bodies illuminated by the dim emergency lights from the other building. There had to be at least 100 of them now, maybe more, all standing in a rough circle around Building 2, their milky eyes fixed on the structure. Waiting. Patient. Like they had all the time in the world. Which, Jake reflected grimly, they kind of did. What do they want? Tommy asked. I mean, are they hungry? Do they need to eat? They don't have working digestive systems, right? So why are they hunting us? Propagation, Rebecca said quietly. If it's a parasite or pathogen controlling them, it wants to spread. We're warm bodies, potential new hosts. It wants to infect us, add us to the collective. The way she said it, so clinical and detached, somehow made it worse. Jake checked his watch. They'd been in Building 2 for about an hour. 5 more hours until extraction. 5 more hours of this nightmare. The building's heating system was still working, running off its own battery backup, but he could feel the cold seeping in through the walls. At these temperatures, thermal mass only helped so much. A thought occurred to him. The cold. That's their weakness. They're adapted to it, yeah, but they're still frozen tissue. They're brittle. Fire and heat would destroy them. Marcus caught on immediately. The generator. If we can get it running again, we can use the heating elements, maybe rig up some kind of thermal weapon. The generators in Building 4, Hank pointed out. We'd have to go outside, cross about 50 yards of open ground, get past all of them. He didn't say it was impossible, but his tone implied it heavily. Brad shook his head frantically. No way. No way am I going back out there. We wait for extraction, we stay here where it's safe. We're not safe, Jake argued. The battery backup will fail, we'll lose heat, and we'll freeze to death in here. Or they'll find another way in. We can't just sit here and hope for the best. The debate might have continued, but it became moot when the creatures outside suddenly started moving. Not toward the building, but away from it, parting like a frozen sea. Something was coming through the gap they created, and when Jake saw it, his mouth went dry. It was bigger than the others, at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in the remnants of what looked like armor made from bone and metal. Its face was hidden behind a mask carved from a mammoth tusk, and it carried a staff topped with a human skull that had been decorated with geometric patterns similar to those on the ice fortress. That's a shaman, Rebecca whispered. Or a priest. Someone important. Look at the burial goods, the craftsmanship. That's someone who led them in life. The creature raised its staff, and the skull on top began to glow with a faint blue light that definitely wasn't natural. The other creatures responded, their moaning taking on a rhythmic quality, almost like chanting. The air itself seemed to grow colder, and frost started spreading across the window in patterns that looked deliberately formed. Okay, that's new and horrible, Tommy said. Please tell me someone else is seeing the glowing skull and the zombie magic. Marcus was already moving, pulling together equipment, making a pack. Change of plans. We're going for the generator. We're not waiting around to see what that thing can do. Hank nodded, checking his rifle. I'll take point. We move fast, stay tight. Jake, you know the generator system best, you're with me. Everyone else stays here, fortifies the position. If we're not back in 30 minutes, seal the door and wait for extraction. Like hell we're splitting up, Linda protested. Have you people never seen a horror movie? Splitting up is how everyone dies. But Marcus was firm. Too many people, we're slower and noisier. Small team, in and out. It's the right play. Jake found himself gearing up, pulling his parka back on, trying not to think about how insane this was. Going back out there, into the cold, into the horde of frozen zombies, to restart a generator. Just another day in the field, right? Nothing unusual about that. Rebecca grabbed his arm as he headed for the door. Be careful. And Jake? If you get bit, if one of them breaks your skin, don't come back. Please. We can't risk infection. The concern in her eyes was genuine, and it warmed him slightly despite the circumstances. I'll be fine, he lied. 30 minutes, tops. Marcus, Hank, and Jake stood at the door, weapons ready. Hank had his rifle, Marcus had his pistol and a flare gun, and Jake had grabbed a propane torch from the maintenance kit, figuring that fire was their best bet against frozen flesh. On 3, Marcus counted down. 1, 2, 3. They burst out of the building into the frozen hell outside. The creatures reacted immediately, surging toward them, but Hank laid down suppressing fire, aiming for heads, dropping them efficiently. Marcus fired the flare gun into the massive bodies, and the burning phosphorus did exactly what Jake had hoped. The frozen flesh caught fire like dried kindling, ancient tissue and rotted furs going up in bright flames. The creatures didn't seem to feel pain, but the fire spread from one to another where they clustered together, creating a barrier of burning bodies. Jake ran like his life depended on it, because it absolutely did. The 50 yards to Building 4 felt like 50 miles. His lungs screamed, his legs burned, and behind him, he could hear the scraping shuffle of pursuing creatures. One got close, its frozen fingers brushing his parka, and he spun, blasting it with the propane torch. The thing's face melted, flash frozen tissue sublimating directly to gas, and it collapsed. They reached Building 4, and Marcus kicked in the door while Hank covered their 6. Inside, the temperature was well below freezing, their breath coming out in great plumes of vapor. The generator sat in the corner, silent and cold. Jake rushed to it, his fingers fumbling with the controls. The startup sequence was normally simple, but with frozen fingers and adrenaline shaking through him, it felt impossible. Come on, he muttered, checking fuel levels, battery charge, ignition system. Everything looked okay. The power line had been physically severed outside, he'd need to bypass it, reroute through the secondary line. He worked with desperate speed, aware of Hank and Marcus at the door, firing controlled shots at the creatures trying to force their way in. "How we doing, Jake?" Marcus called out. "Almost there, just need to," the generator coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Lights flickered on throughout the building, and more importantly, the heating elements started glowing. Jake cranked them to maximum, then grabbed an industrial-grade heat blower, the kind they use for thawing frozen equipment. "Got it. Let's move." But leaving was harder than entering had been. The creatures had surrounded Building 4, a solid wall of frozen bodies blocking every exit. Through the window, Jake could see that tall shaman figure, its staff still glowing, directing its followers like a conductor with an orchestra. "We're boxed in," Hank reported, his voice tense. "I count at least 40 hostiles between us and Building 2. My ammo's running low." Marcus looked around frantically, then up. "The roof." "We go up, cross over to Building 3 via the connecting catwalk, then down and back to Building 2. It's exposed, but it's better than going through them." There was a roof access ladder in the corner. They went up, pushing through the hatch into the full fury of the Arctic storm. The wind nearly blew Jake off his feet, and the cold was so intense it felt like his eyeballs might freeze solid. The catwalk between buildings was a narrow metal walkway, coated in ice, swaying in the wind. One slip and it was a 20-foot drop onto frozen ground. Or worse, onto the creatures below. They started across, and that's when the shambling figures began to climb. The creatures scaled the sides of the buildings with disturbing ease, their frozen fingers finding purchase in tiny cracks and seams. "They're coming up!" Jake yelled over the wind. Hank turned, fired, dropped one that was pulling itself over the roof edge, but 2 more took its place. Marcus pulled Jake forward. "Don't stop, keep moving." They ran across the catwalk, feet slipping on ice, the whole structure shaking with each step. Jake didn't look down. Looking down would be bad. A hand grabbed his ankle, and he screamed, kicking hard. A creature had climbed onto the catwalk itself, pulling itself along hand over hand. Jake blasted it with the propane torch, and it released him, falling backward into the darkness below. They made it to Building 3, dropped through the roof hatch, and slammed it shut behind them. Something pounded on it from above, a rhythmic hammering that echoed through the building. "Keep moving," Marcus ordered. They ran through Building 3, which was their storage facility, full of crates and equipment, and Jake had never been so happy to see their stockpile of supplies. Food, water, medical equipment, and most importantly, more fuel. He grabbed 2 cans of diesel fuel, an idea forming. I can make incendiaries, Molotov cocktails, if we've got bottles and rags. Do it, Marcus agreed. Hank and I will get back to Building 2, make sure everyone's okay. You've got 5 minutes, then you follow us, got it? Jake nodded, already pulling together supplies. Marcus and Hank disappeared through the connecting corridor, and Jake was alone. He worked fast, finding empty bottles from their water supply, siphoning diesel fuel into them, stuffing rags into the necks. Basic, crude, but effective. He'd made about 6 when he heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere deeper in the storage building. They'd found another way in. Jake grabbed his makeshift bombs and the propane torch and ran for the connecting corridor. Behind him, he heard the shuffling footsteps, the hollow moaning. He burst into Building 2, and hands immediately grabbed him, pulled him inside. Marcus slammed the door, and Tommy welded it shut with shaking hands. Did you get them? Rebecca asked, eyeing the bottles of fuel. Yeah, Jake gasped. But we've got a problem. They're in Building 3 now. They're going to spread through the whole complex. Hank was at the window, and his expression was grim. The perimeter's completely overrun. There's got to be 200 of them out there now. Where are they all coming from? The ice fortress, Rebecca said. It must have held an entire community, maybe multiple communities. Thousands of bodies, all preserved, all infected with whatever this is. And we woke them all up. The full weight of what they'd done settled over the group. They hadn't just discovered an archaeological site. They'd opened Pandora's box, releasing an ancient plague that had been safely locked away for 10 millennia. And now it was loose, and they were trapped in the middle of it. Linda's camera was still rolling, documenting everything. If we don't make it, she said quietly, at least there'll be a record. People will know what happened. The emergency lights flickered. Battery power was running low. Jake checked his watch. 3 more hours until extraction. They could make it. They had to make it. Brad was rocking back and forth on one of the bunks, his eyes glazed. This isn't happening. This isn't real. We're going to wake up and this is all going to be a bad dream. Stay with us, Brad, Marcus said firmly. I need everyone focused. We're getting out of this. All of us. That's an order. The building shuddered as something heavy impacted the outer wall. The creatures were trying to break through, using their frozen bodies as battering rams. The wall held, but for how long? Tommy had an idea. The heating system. We still have heat in here, right? What if we vented it outside, cranked it up as high as possible? Create a heat barrier around the building. The system's not designed for that, Jake said, but he was already thinking through the mechanics. But if we bypass the safeties, reroute all the heat to the external vents, yeah, we might be able to create a thermal barrier. It'd burn out the system eventually, but it might keep them back. It was worth a shot. Jake and Tommy worked together, accessing the control panel, rewiring circuits with increasingly creative interpretations of electrical codes and safety regulations. Heat started pouring out of the external vents, shimmering waves of it that immediately started sublimating the snow around the building. The creatures recoiled from it, their frozen flesh unable to tolerate the warmth. It created a clear zone, maybe 10 feet around the building, where they couldn't approach. It's working, Rebecca breathed. They're backing off. But the shaman figure raised its staff again, and that eerie blue glow intensified. The creatures stopped retreating. They stood just outside the heat barrier, swaying slightly, and then they started to change. Frost spread across their bodies, thickening, forming armor-like layers. They were adapting, using the extreme cold to shield themselves from the heat. Oh, come on, Jake muttered. That's not fair. That's just not fair. The ice-armored creatures started advancing again, slower now, but inexorable. The heat seared away the outer layers of frost, but they kept reforming, the extreme ambient temperature working in the zombies' favor. They were going to get through eventually. Hank made a command decision. "Marcus, give me your phone. I'm calling an audible." He dialed a number from memory, waited for it to connect. "This is Hank Miller, authorization code Delta 77 Tango. I need immediate air support at my coordinates. Danger close, mission critical, authorization for lethal force." He listened for a moment. "I don't care what the weather conditions are, you get birds in the air now or we're all dead. Do you understand?" "Good." Miller out. Marcus stared at him. "What did you just do?" "Called in a favor," Hank replied. "I've got friends in low places. There's a couple of attack helicopters that were doing cold weather training about 100 miles from here. They're going to try to reach us, provide air support until the extraction team arrives." Brad laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "Helicopter gunships. We've got zombie Nazis and now we're calling in helicopter gunships. This is the weirdest day of my life." "They're not Nazis," Rebecca corrected automatically. "They're Neolithic peoples, probably predating any organized," she cut off as the building shuddered again, harder this time. A crack appeared in one of the walls. "Okay, you know what, they can be Nazis, I don't care anymore. I just want to live." The next hour was the longest of Jake's life. The creatures kept up constant pressure on the building, testing the walls, the door, looking for any weakness. The team huddled in the center of the room, weapons ready, Jake's Molotov cocktails lined up and ready to use. The emergency lights dimmed to almost nothing as the batteries approached failure. And outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to their struggle. Then, like a miracle, they heard it, the distant thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. Hank was at the window instantly. "That's them. Everyone get down, away from the walls." The helicopters came in low and fast, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the scene below. Jake got a glimpse through the window and his stomach dropped. There weren't just 200 creatures out there. There were thousands. The entire frozen plain was covered with shambling bodies, all converging on their position. The ice fortress must have held an entire ancient civilization, and they'd all come out to play. The helicopters opened fire, their miniguns screaming, tearing through frozen flesh like a buzzsaw. Rockets streaked down, exploding among the horde, sending bodies flying in pieces. It was devastating, apocalyptic, and absolutely beautiful. The creatures had no defense against modern military firepower. They fell in waves, torn apart, burned, obliterated. But there were so many of them. For every 10 that fell, 20 more took their place. "Attention ground team," a voice crackled over Hank's radio. "We can't maintain this for long, fuel and ammo are limited. Extraction team is inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Hold your position, we'll keep them off you." 15 minutes. They could do 15 minutes. The helicopters circled, laying down suppressive fire, creating a perimeter of destruction around Building 2. The shaman figure was directing its forces, trying to coordinate an assault, but even ancient zombie magic had a hard time standing up to 20mm autocannons. One of the helicopters got too low, and creatures swarmed up from below, grabbing onto the landing skids. The pilot tried to shake them off, gaining altitude, but more kept climbing up, a ladder of frozen bodies reaching toward the sky. Jake watched in horror as they reached the doors, started trying to force their way into the crew compartment. The helicopter spun, trying to dislodge them, but there were too many. "They're going down," Hank said quietly. The helicopter tilted, spiraled, and crashed into the ice about half a mile away, exploding in a ball of flame that briefly turned night into day. The second helicopter pulled back, still firing, but more cautiously now. The pilot's voice was tight with stress. "Ground team, be advised, I'm Winchester on rockets, down to guns only. You need to prepare for immediate extraction. The other birds down, I can't hold them alone." The building shook as something massive impacted it. The shaman had moved closer, and Jake realized what it was doing. The creature was using its staff to direct others, having them pile up against the building, creating a ramp of bodies. And they were climbing over each other, getting higher, reaching toward the roof. "They're trying to collapse the building," Tommy yelled. "The weight, the structural stress, they're going to bring it down on us." Marcus made the call. "Everyone grab emergency gear, we're going to the roof. We'll be extracted from there." They scrambled up the internal ladder to the roof hatch, pushing through it into the screaming wind and darkness. The helicopter swung around, its spotlight fixing on them, and Jake could see the crew chief gesturing frantically, motioning them toward the approaching aircraft. But the creatures were on the roof too, pulling themselves up from all sides. Hank fired his rifle, now on his last magazine. Marcus was out of pistol ammo, using his weapon as a club. Jake lit one of his Molotov cocktails, threw it into the massive bodies, creating a wall of flame. Brad and Tommy were fighting with tools and equipment, desperate and terrified. Linda was still filming, because some part of her knew this had to be documented, the world had to know. Rebecca was using a ice axe with the precision of someone who'd had absolutely enough of this nonsense. The helicopter came in, hovering as close as it dared, the crew chief extending a rescue hoist. "Go, go, go!" Marcus shouted. Linda went first, clipping onto the hoist, getting lifted away. Then Tommy, then Brad. Jake threw his last Molotov, trying to buy them seconds. The flames spread, the heat and fire doing what it did best to frozen flesh. Rebecca was next, her eyes meeting Jake's for a moment before she clipped in and rose into the sky. Jake and Marcus and Hank were alone on the roof, surrounded by burning bodies and reaching hands and that awful moaning. The hoist came down again. "You first," Marcus told Jake. No arguments. Jake clipped in, felt the cable go tight, and then he was rising, the roof falling away below him. He saw Hank go down, overwhelmed by a wave of creatures, still fighting to the last. Saw Marcus struggling, trying to reach the hoist. The cable swung wildly in the wind, slamming Jake against the helicopter's side, and hands pulled him in, unclipped him. "There's still two down there," he screamed at the crew chief. The hoist went down again, and Jake watched Marcus fight his way to it, clip on, start to rise. A hand grabbed his leg. The shaman, its carved mask staring up with empty eyes, was climbing Marcus like a ladder, pulling itself up his body. Marcus struggled, trying to shake it off, but the thing was strong, driven by ancient hunger and unholy purpose. And then Marcus did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. He unclipped himself. He fell, taking the shaman with him, back down into the massive creatures below. "No!" Jake screamed, but it was too late. Marcus was gone, swallowed by the horde. The helicopter banked hard, pulling away, and the last thing Jake saw was the frozen plane covered in thousands of shambling bodies, the burning wreckage of the downed helicopter, and the ice fortress in the distance, still vomiting out more of the frozen dead. Then they were flying, racing through the storm, leaving that nightmare behind. The survivors huddled in the helicopter's crew bay, wrapped in blankets, shell-shocked and traumatized. They'd lost Marcus and Hank. They'd unleashed an ancient horror on the world. And Jake knew, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't over. Those things were still down there, thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, spreading out across the frozen wasteland. They'd survived 10,000 years in the ice, waiting. And now they were awake, and they were hungry, and nothing short of a nuclear strike was going to stop them. As the helicopter carried them toward safety, Jake looked at the others, saw his own horror reflected in their faces. Rebecca was crying silently, Linda was clutching her camera like a lifeline, Tommy and Brad were just staring into space, trying to process what they'd survived. The crew chief handed Jake a headset, and he put it on, heard the chatter from the Rescue Coordination Center, frantic voices trying to understand what had happened. "What do we tell them?" Jake asked quietly. "Who's going to believe us?" Rebecca held up Linda's camera. "We tell them the truth. We show them the evidence. And we pray they believe us in time to do something about it." The helicopter flew on through the storm, carrying its cargo of survivors and terrible knowledge. Behind them, in the frozen wasteland where the temperature never rose above -60°C, thousands of ancient bodies shambled through the darkness, patient and relentless, waiting for their chance to spread, to consume, to reclaim a world they'd lost 10,000 years ago. The dead had risen in the coldest place on Earth, and Jake had the sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of something much, much worse.